What's up, everybody? This is chapter 4 of Svetozar Stojanović, Between Ideals and Reality, a critique of socialism and its future, translated by Gerson S. Scher. Chapter 4 is titled The Communist Party at the Crossroads. So let's rock. Section 1. The historical process called socialism can be approached in three ways. First, proceeding from a purely normative definition of socialism, one can hold that existing social reality, taken as a whole, does not have a socialist character even in the most elementary sense. Second, one can recognize the socialist identity of a total social process which itself claims to be socialist. While the first approach plainly has no point of contact with historical reality, the second has too much, as the second approach acknowledges any reality to be socialist, which has declared itself. The third, or Marxist approach, is distinguished from the second because the Marxist approach proceeds from a definition of socialism by means of which one can distinguish in the historical process between what is socialist and what merely pretends to be. The Marxist approach also differs from the normative approach, however, because the Marxist approach takes the defining elements of socialism from the revolutionary process itself and admits the possibility of various stages of socialism. In rejecting the socialist identity of Stalinist society, I have been at pains to extract the minimum criteria of socialism from the revolutionary process which preceded Stalinism, a process which even the Stalinists have not denied was of a socialist nature. In almost all the revolutionary fermentations of our epoch, the proletariat has spontaneously insisted upon the introduction of the proletariat's self-management. Russia of both 1905 and 1917, both in the February and October revolutions, was no exception. The soldiers and the peasants joined the working class in creating the Soviets. The Bolshevik Party grasped the significance of this revolutionary creativity of the proletariat and its allies, and it triumphed with its motto, quote, "All power to the Soviets," end quote. The Soviets confirmed in practice Marx's thesis about the historical self-activity of the proletariat, which found its way into the statutes of the First International, quote, "The emancipation of the working class must be the work of the working class itself," end quote. Marx. The nationalization of the means of production accomplished by the state of Soviets represented the beginning of real socialization. The extraordinary revolutionary spontaneity of the proletariat was perfectly complemented by the revolutionary organization of the Bolsheviks. The Soviets served as the basic model for the construction of the new form of social organization. Unfortunately, however, the Bolshevik Party later replaced the Soviet as the model of social organization. I would say very early on. That's just my opinion, though. The attitude began to prevail that self-management had to be postponed until the working class had attained a mass status and a relatively high level of education, and the revolution's frail proletarian base came to be neutralized. While the Soviets gradually were transformed into the forms of state organization, all social life became tied to the party-state apparatus. In this way, the dialectical relationship between the Communist Party and the state of Soviets on the one hand, and the working class on the other, was upset and finally destroyed. From that point on, this state party and party state was confronted with merely abstract history. The Soviet state remained, quote, Soviet in name only. Critical analysis of communist organization usually fails to proceed to its logical conclusion, to an examination of the nature of the socioeconomic system which that organization creates. The party's nature must be defined on this basis rather than on the basis of communism as the proclaimed goal. When this kind of approach is used, the statist, Stalinist myth of the Communist Party, an important element of the statist myth of socialism, is laid bare. Section 2. The core of the Communist Party, which operates in conditions of illegality, is composed of professional revolutionaries. Such a party is completely centralized, even militarized. The party's membership does not elect the party's leaders. On the contrary, it is the leaders who select and recruit the membership. Because of the conditions in which the party operates, monolithism, discipline, hierarchy, duty, responsibility, and appointments develop at the cost of diversity, initiative, democracy, rights, and choice. In this period, party centralism undoubtedly plays a revolutionary role, even though party centralism is hardly democratic in nature. Lenin said that in such circumstances, a communist party would be able to carry out that communist party's duty only if that communist party's organization were extremely centralized, if iron discipline bordering on military discipline reigned within that communist party, and if the party's center were an authoritative organ having a great deal of power and enjoying the universal confidence of the party's members. Trotsky went even further, stating at the 13th Congress of the Bolshevik Party that, quote, "The party is always right because the party is the sole historical means at the disposal of the proletariat for the solution of the proletariat's fundamental problems, ... One can be right only with the party and with the party's help, as history has not created any other path for the realization of what is right," end quote. One of Trotsky's most embarrassing quotes, I might add. Lukács described such a party rather well when Lukács spoke of the, quote, "unconditional absorption of the total personality in the praxis of the movement," end quote. But at the same time, Lukács implicitly emphasized the limits which were to be transgressed by the Stalinist party, the product of the degeneration of the Leninist party. For Lukács, party discipline is revolutionary discipline. Party discipline is the, quote, "conscious subordination of the self to the common will," end quote. A, quote, "free and conscious deed," end quote, without which iron discipline would turn into a, quote, "reified abstract system of rights and duties," end quote. Lukács, History and Class Consciousness. The Leninist type of party can serve as an organizational and action framework for true revolutionaries only until they seize and consolidate power. Party centralism without democracy plays a revolutionary role only for a while. Party centralism's absolutization transforms party centralism into oligarchic centralism, which masquerades in an increasingly persistent fashion as democratic centralism. Since the party constitutes the backbone of state power, it is in a position to fashion all social organization in its own image. The final product of this process is oligarchic statism, which I have discussed in greater detail in the preceding chapter. The Stalinist party alienates decision-making not only from the working class and the laboring masses, but from its own membership as well. Perhaps no one has more aptly described the essence of such a party than the secretary of a party cell in China. When asked, quote, "what is communism," end quote, he replied, quote, "I don't know myself, but there are wise and enterprising people in our party. They always know what they are doing. There is only one thing which we little people must do. We must follow them throughout our lives," end quote. Of course, when the party membership is transformed into the transmission belt of the leadership, the same relationship will hold all the more for non-party organizations. Beginning with the state apparatus, the entire society becomes the mere executor of the decisions of the party summit. This is the origin of politocracy, or more accurately, partocracy, as a specific feature of this type of statism. The principle of the transmission belt was applied even to the entire Third International. The Third International's leadership, which was actually chosen by Stalin, appointed and dismissed the leadership of the other communist parties. The genuine authority of the Leninist party thus turned into the monopolism and hegemonism of the Stalinist party over the international communist movement. And there's a footnote here that I missed that says, the Bolshevik Party's revolutionary centralism had some elements of democracy during Lenin's lifetime. End footnote. Section 3. As soon as it seizes and consolidates power, the Communist Party is confronted with the problem of whether that Communist Party will remain the vanguard of the proletarian masses or degenerate into an oligarchic statist party. If its degeneration into an oligarchic statist party is not to happen, the Leninist Party must undergo radical democratic reform. Experience has shown that none of the palliatives and pseudo-innovations in the history of the various reorganizations undertaken by communist parties have been of any avail in this respect. It is essential that the communist organization, having a complete monopoly of state power, remove all the obstacles from the path of the development of social self-government. In other words, that it gradually divest itself of state power. A self-governing society can be created only by an organization which democratizes itself from the base upward. Only then can the Communist Party attain the level described by Antonio Gramsci. Quote, "The Communist Party is the tool and historical form of the process of emancipation in which the worker from a performer becomes a mover. From a performer becomes a mover. The mass becomes the leader. From the mass becomes the leader. From the hands becomes the brain and the will. In the formation of the Communist Party is the seed of freedom, which will develop and approach its full breadth when the state of the workers will have organized the necessary material conditions." End quote. Antonio Gramsci, Prison Notebooks. Political Writings, excuse me. So long as it has identified itself with power, the Communist Party has not been in a position to check up on the Communist Party's avant-gardism. In order to continue to play a revolutionary role, the party must deliberately seek to transcend the party's monopolistic power-holding dimension. The democratic measures which ought to be undertaken in the Communist Party are well known, and there is no need to enumerate them here. The Communist Party is characterized by the division of professional leaders who make decisions from the membership which executes those decisions. This model of party life conflicts with the scheme for a society which itself makes decisions concerning itself. Communists, in order to triumph, must associate into an organization which is led by professional revolutionaries, but after their victory they become professional wielders of power. The dominant part of the Communist Party is composed precisely of the possessors of state power, political, economic, and military functionaries, civil servants, and all. Thus the party's social composition itself tends to create status society, but according to its program, the Communist Party must become the prototype of a society in which decision-making is not a distinct profession. The workers and the creators of material and cultural values in general must predominate in every facet of the life of a party which aspires to constitute the free association of producers. The struggle to radically reform the party stumbles, as a rule, upon the party's peculiar conception of democratic centralism. What ought to be subsumed under this principle? First, that the membership define as directly as possible the party's policies, and second, that the minority recognize the decision of the majority as binding upon all. In practice, the Communist Party puts immeasurably greater emphasis upon the latter. But when this conception of majority rule develops at the expense of the former condition, it is usually the case that the decisive factor becomes a fictitious rather than a real majority. In those communist parties in which democratization has begun, there is a severe struggle over the understanding of the relationship between the majority and the minority. According to one interpretation of democratic centralism, which prevails in all the communist parties in power, the minority is obliged not only to accept the decision of the majority in matters of practice, but also to curtail debate and criticism once a given decision has been reached. The principle of democratic centralism understood in this way obliges the membership not only to unity of action, but also, when taken to the extreme, to unity of opinion. In the permanent conflict with this monolithism is the democratic pluralist concept, in which the minority has the right to hold its own views and to try to demonstrate their superiority. In order to ensure its practical efficacy and to prevent the party from falling to pieces, it is enough that the given decision be commonly executed in practice, all the while being checked in a constantly renewed democratic process. These rights of the minority were introduced into the action program of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia before the occupation of 1968, a program which allowed for the greatest range of democracy in a communist party in power since the relatively short-lived period of a similar nature in Lenin's party. In communist parties in which there are some elements of democracy, even though the rights of the minority are not ensured, there are regular oscillations in the political atmosphere. In periods of enthusiasm, it is insisted that all members have the freedom to present their views. But as soon as serious differences of thought arise, the monolithic tendency in the party once again tries to impose absolute unanimity and to organize campaigns and even undertake sanctions against those who differ from the, quote, line as it is seen by the monolithists. The latter try to make, quote, 100 flowers bloom, end quote, but only so long as they do not flourish. We're in the case of Mao and the anti-rightist campaign after the 100 Flowers campaign. He later characterized the 100 Flowers campaign as a tool, as a ploy, basically, to, I think the quote is, bring snakes out from under their rocks. And if the flowers should come into full bloom, the monolithists try to uproot all but one of them. They also declare themselves in favor of the struggle of opinions, but are seized by panic as soon as it becomes apparent that there can be no, quote, struggle of opinions which are essentially all the same. It never occurs to them that the minority stands firm on the minority's position because of the nature of the problem under discussion, and not out of absence of desire to reach an agreement. The monolithic conception prevents the party from breaking out of a vicious circle. Free debate, campaigns against dissidents, lethargy, stimulation of free debate, and so on. The conservative wing of the party permanently holds the swords of Damocles of monolithic centralism over the heads of communists who have an inquiring and avant-garde spirit. Occasionally, even the progressive wing of the party makes use of the monolithic principle, but directly, of course, against the conservative wing. The progressives firmly believe in democratic pluralism at those times when the progressives have achieved total victory over the conservatives, but this is only the most ordinary kind of rationalization, as the progressives then rather quickly begin to attack communists more progressive than they, and thus themselves become conservatives. It is a great fallacy to think that real democracy can be achieved by enforcing monolithism. Monolithism always goes hand in hand with monopoly of leadership. So long as the minority does not have the rights about which we have been speaking here, the initiative for policy revision can only come from the summit of the party hierarchy, because it, by definition, represents the party majority. In such an atmosphere, it is impossible for the membership to check the pretensions of its leadership to represent the party majority. The leadership stubbornly curtails discussions which have already started, as the leadership fears that its, quote, majority may be smothered or even shown to be fictitious. So long as there are no permanent possibilities for debate and criticism, there will be no genuine public opinion in the party. And without it, the party hierarchy is impenetrable, with differing conceptions and their advocates invisible. Since all the party's members try to present a front of unanimity, nor is it surprising that in such a situation a factual minority should happen to usurp the role of the majority, and that it should cynically appeal to the real majority to subordinate itself according to the principle of democratic centralism. The monolithists claim that recognizing the rights of the minority would lead to the party's disintegration. However, this need not happen if the principle of democratic centralism is used to bind the majority and the minority to unity of action. Any durable party unity can grow only out of the democratic confrontation of diverse ideas. While people can be disciplined to act in a certain way, it is fortunately impossible to impose unconditional terms on the way in which they generate ideas. Artificial curtailment of discussion and criticism creates only the illusion of monolithism. Unity of action is threatened, if at all, not so much by the expression of differences of opinion as by the very existence of such differences. The duty to pretend that a common view has been reached only frustrates people, who then become even more bitter and inclined to underhandedly sabotage the realization of the acclaimed policy. Such a state is more suitable for unprincipled groupism, precisely that which the monolithists want to avoid by retracting the rights of the minority. The opponents of the rights of the minority tried to prove that recognition of these rights would sanction duplicity. The minority would do one thing while saying another. Actually, the minority acts hypocritically only when the minority is compelled to conceal the minority's views. While the majority is even more hypocritical when the majority pretends not to notice this. The least amount of duplicity would exist were people to work together while expressing differences of opinion toward the realization of decisions democratically reached, for they would then know where the border is between democracy and anarchy. The kind of loyalty of the minority to the majority has its moral dimension, i.e. respect for the equal rights of all the party's members. Those who remain in the minority can try to change the given decision in a democratic manner. Only when participation in executing a decision demands that they violate their most basic principles will they openly say so and withdraw from the party. But the majority must also be loyal to the minority and recognize its right to hold its own opinion. Only in such a communist party is a synthesis possible between unity and diversity, between discipline and freedom. Section 4. The monolithic form of organization gives rise to dogmatism and even occasional anti-intellectualism in communist parties. These phenomena are so noticeable in the Stalinist parties that they need to be emphasized no further here, but they appear as well in those parties which, though they do not recognize the rights of the minority, still have some democratic features. A certain degree of suspicion toward intellectuals reigned over even in the early history of the communist movement. According to Kautsky and Lenin, the intelligentsia is inclined to individualism and lack of discipline. Zinoviev's sharp attack on professors at the Fifth Congress of the Communist International was only the first of a series of similar occasions in the history of communist parties. Symptomatically, it has most frequently been the party intellectual leaders themselves who have almost masochistically advocated the thesis of a discrepancy between the quote honorable and quote dishonorable intelligentsia, even though they have not made a similar differentiation in the case of workers and the peasantry. I mean, they most certainly did do that, actually. Not from, if you listen to the piece, I'll have it up soon, the book by Bedeline. Basically, like the idealization of the worker, the workerism of Stalinism was used as a tool to discipline workers. So, like, for instance, there was the good workers who were, like, industrious and are not self-serving. There are those who are shirkers and seek special privileges. Anyway, in those communist parties in which the monolithic conception prevails, it is characteristic that the ideological theoretical monopoly of the leadership is constantly being renewed. This ideological centralism, a consequence of political organizational and staff centralism, has devastating consequences in the realm of ideas. All the most important theoretical initiatives are weighted from the party summit, so that it remains for the lower levels to merely accept them and work them out. Thus the theorists are divided into quote party and quote non-party elements, even within the party itself. The leadership has become accustomed to formulating decisions and implementing them rapidly. Any debate which does eventually ensue is only for the purpose of confirming these decisions. It can never contrive its own. In such a party, to be, quote, ideological, unquote, means very often to be without any ideas at all, to echo other people's ideas, even if the leadership has not formulated its stance before the discussion. At the conclusion of debate, it emerges as the open, unopposed arbiter. The party leadership allows differing opinions, but only until the party leadership specifies which of the differing opinions are within the, quote, line and which ought to be attacked. The kind of leadership makes some very democratic declarations about the freedom of scientific and cultural creativity and the demonopolized and unlimited nature of social criticism. But later on, it turns fiercely upon those who have taken them literally. Those intellectuals who have spoken critically of the party's general policy, rather than only of party partial measures, receive the leadership's hardest blows. The leadership explains disagreements in the party as a result of, quote, deviation, or the influence of these intellectuals, rather than as a consequence of the complexity of the problems under consideration or of differentiation in the party membership's social existence. If it later appropriates some of these intellectuals' ideas, the leadership does all it can to stigmatize their authors even further, as it desires to maintain its monopoly on avant-gardism. And if a political crisis should result, the leadership explains it in a typically ideological, inverted manner. It looks for the cause of the crisis in the influence of, quote, disobedient, unquote, intellectuals, rather than in serious social problems and the broad dissatisfaction with which these problems evoke. This is how materialists behave when materialists find it temporarily necessary to become idealists! Exclamation point. If it finds itself compelled to approve of an action of some social group against accumulated social deformations, the leadership proclaims that these intellectuals are the instigators and organizers of that action, but still do not practice them as one would logically expect, but instead attacks them most severely. Thus, after an official acknowledgement of the existence of deformations, if it finds itself compelled to approve of an action of some social group against accumulated social deformations, the leadership proclaims that these intellectuals are the instigators and organizers of that action, but still does not praise them, as one would logically expect, but instead attacks them most severely. Thus, after an official acknowledgement of the existence of deformations, it is the critics of these phenomena who are expelled from the party rather than those who are really responsible, whether through direct cause or through toleration. The very leadership which has undertaken many fiascos and costly experiments jealously attacks and excludes those who experiment solely in the realm of ideas. There are some party leaders who, formerly having been pioneers in theoretical work, have lagged behind the development of theory. In the meantime, of course, an entire succession of serious theorists has matured in the base of the party. But the party summit finds it impossible to free itself of its illusions about its theoretical capacity and reacts vainly and arrogantly whenever its theoretical monopoly is threatened. Thus, a great deal of attention is devoted to discovering and dealing with, quote, cases of intellectual heresy, while the party sinks ever deeper into pragmaticism. If someone, quote, must be sacrificed to the conservatives, the liberal wing must readily agree to select these intellectuals as the victims. Since Marx's death, the higher positions in the communist movement have been increasingly occupied by strong-willed people who have not, however, possessed a great deal of knowledge or talent for theory. That is why the theoretical level of the leadership of the majority of present-day communist parties is so low. As the very concept of the communist movement is based upon the unity of theory and practice, pragmatic empiricism can only have catastrophic consequences. So, just a side note, at the time that he's writing this book in the late 60s, Brezhnev would have been the leader of the Soviet Union. And there's some quote from Brezhnev, is like, he's talking to like a speechwriter or something, it's like, you guys should probably cut out the parts about Marx. No one's going to believe that I've read any Marx. Something like that. As the very concept of the communist movement is based upon the unity of theory and practice, pragmatic empiricism can only have catastrophic consequences. In the monolithic parties, a peculiar kind of cognitive relativism prevails. The truthfulness of any new idea is evaluated according to its author's position in the party hierarchy. Therefore, the party is interested not primarily in what is said, but in who says it, when, where, about whom, with what motives, in what form, before whom, what is, quote, behind it, who will profit by it, whose interest it reflects, and so on. The substantive content of what is said, which is the sole matter of relevance for its truthfulness, is completely pushed into the background. The center of attention is assumed by the author in the situational context of the statement. That which surrounds the truth becomes more important than the truth itself. In such circumstances, quote, the most embarrassing thing of all is when the wrong person says the right thing, end quote. The truth of authority replaces the authority of truth. Even the concept of, quote, truth itself increasingly yields before the concept of, quote, correctness. Such a state will continue to exist until the Communist Party finds it necessary to struggle to win over all the intellectual forces of the nation. The Communist Party will become more attractive to autonomous intellectuals as the Communist Party rejects the role of ideological fireman, sentry, and arbiter, and as the Communist Party becomes the initiator of inquiry, experiment, and the spirit of adventure. The party must never forget that, quote, there would be no fireman had there not been a Prometheus, end quote. If the party leadership is not fond of certain ideas put forth by scientists, artists, or philosophers, the party leadership must ask what it is in social reality which has aroused their sensibilities rather than anathematizing them. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx wrote, quote, the communists, therefore, are on the one hand practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, the communists have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. End quote. Marx, Engels, Communist Manifesto. In order for the party to truly to become a, quote, collective thinker, unquote, Gramsci, the party must emancipate the party's self from the party's monolithic obsessions. Theory has theory's own possibilities and theory's own internal rhythm. Serious theoretical work demands internal continuity, even the continuity of a favorable party climate. It is nearly impossible to work on theory when periods of explicit summonses to intellectuals to open debate and criticism alternate as a rule, with waves of severe disqualification and political attack upon the most sincere and bold among them. Section 5. Communists in power, with few exceptions, speak disdainfully of the possibility of a multi-party system. The majority of communists in power still look upon the opportunity of Western citizens to choose among candidates of several parties as a purely formal freedom, as if these communists in power forget that in these systems there are also leftist parties, of which a few are very influential. It is certainly true that real political power in these countries resides in the summits of the party apparatuses rather than in the hands of the voters. Generalizing this state of affairs, Hans Kelsen, who's like an important legal theorist, I think, has asserted that democracy is the political process whereby one elite in power is replaced by another. The limitations of the political arrangement of bourgeois society are even more striking when we take into account the fact that voters are poorly informed and under the influence of the means of mass communication, which are more accessible to the wealthier parties, as well as the fact that, as a rule, there is no radical opposition among the parties which do have a real chance of electoral victory, and so on. However, we should not anticipate an effective critique of the multi-party system from the apologists of the one-party system. In detracting from parliamentary democracy, they try to divert attention from the weaknesses of their own system. Rather than reducing the shortcomings of the multi-party system, however, the one-party system only exaggerates the shortcomings of the multi-party system. Choice among the candidates of various parties is still choice, even if the choices are all rather similar. While choice, quote, between one candidate is a contradiction in terms. Competition among various parties limits political monopoly to a certain degree, whereas the one-party system is founded upon monopoly. The communist parties of the developed capitalist countries have recognized the advantages of the multi-party system and have pledged themselves to political pluralism after they eventually take power. They no longer deny that the multi-party system, other conditions being equal, is more democratic than the one-party system. But from this abstract theoretical comparison, nothing follows directly for the construction of socialism in any given country. One-party dogmatism still exists, and in the highly developed countries, this would lead irreversibly to sectarian isolation. On the other hand, the multi-party model as well can become transformed into dogma if applied in undeveloped conditions. Politicians usually feel the need to justify the choice of the one-party model by referring to certain theoretical factors. Thus, it is most commonly claimed in Yugoslavia that self-governing society is incompatible in principle with party struggles for power, and that we should therefore aspire to non-party democracy. Footnote. Many people naively imagine that such democracy would be monistic. Actually, the development of socialist society will present increasingly greater opportunities and needs for true democratic pluralism. But non-party pluralism is simply an idea which is not as yet worked out. That this is clear from an attempt to explain this concept to a person who speaks another ideological political language. For the time being, it can only be assumed that in highly developed socialist society, political organization will be much more elastic, fluid, and democratic than in a centralized system party, whether one party or multi-party of association. End footnote. But Why can the transition to such democracy not be accomplished through a multi-party rather than a one-party framework? Apparently, the justification must be sought on the practical rather than the theoretical plane. A party system, monistic or pluralistic, is not a value in itself, but only a means for the realization of more fundamental values. Accordingly, the correct question is whether the formation of many parties in a given country would help to realize socialist goals or whether it would jeopardize them instead. To establish a multi-party system in such a country as present-day Yugoslavia would most likely spell catastrophe for Yugoslavia's revolution. A peasant and petty bourgeois social structure is still dominant in our country. Sections of the country are still very undeveloped. We still have national and religious strife. The country has almost no democratic tradition. And then 25 years have passed since the terrible civil and religious war with the occupation and quislings that accompanied it. In addition, although no less importantly, one must take account of the serious external danger to Yugoslavia, a danger which is not about to disappear in the near future. A multi-party system would facilitate and legalize the organizational concentration of both Stalinist and pro-bourgeois forces, thus threatening Yugoslavia's existence as an independent country. It is generally recognized that the multi-party systems function most effectively where there is a high level of political tolerance and consensus about the procedures of competition for power. These conditions are met by developed countries in which there are no severe contradictions, and in which there is a strong middle stratum to serve as the bearer of the continuity of the existing socioeconomic system. Inter-party struggle for power in Yugoslavia would result in political instability, which would in turn imperil further democratization, as well as the results of the liberalization which has been effected thus far. The pro-bourgeois and pro-Stalinist party would each try to render social self-government null and void. In summary, any serious attempt to introduce a multi-party system in Yugoslavia, as it is today, would most probably be only to the advantage of the most treacherous statist forces and help them to strike a blow under the pretext of, quote, saving the revolution. Thus, we should not view the political development of a country such as Yugoslavia through the eyes of Western pluralism. In our conditions, the party monopoly will be disappearing as a result of two factors. First, the further dispersion of centers of decision-making on the basis of self-management, and second, serious changes in the mode of political organization. Unfortunately, the other political organizations in Yugoslavia function to a significant degree as the transmission belts for the League of Communists, even though the League rejected such roles, at least in theory, long ago. Footnote, bracket, translator's note. At the Sixth Party Congress in 1952, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, the CPY, was redesignated as the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, LCY, a move which involved a decentralization of authority within the League, as well as a rejection of the Soviet formula of the, quote, leading role of the party, end quote, in favor of a more modest definition of the League's political and ideological role, end bracket, end footnote. Where the hell am I? This kind of political unanimity must be replaced by a unique sort of pluralism. The existing socioeconomic organizations must be on an equal status with the League of Communists. Otherwise, the citizenry cannot have real self-government, as political activity is immeasurably more effective when it is organized than when it is not. The communist minority can still, if it wants, tutor the majority composed of the rest of the nation's citizens. It is especially important that the working class reform its trade union organization and use it to enter, as a whole, upon the political stage. In this way, it can best pose the question of its share in the distribution of the total social product and in total social power. The League of Communists will be able to justify the exceptional position in the political system which it may hold in the future only insofar as it reinforces and advocates this kind of democratic development. And it will be suited to this role only in the measure that it rapidly and radically democratizes itself. Recognition of the rights of the minority would facilitate the expression of diverse socialist views even within the communist organization, thereby undercutting the impulse toward factionalization or even the formation of separate political organizations. Unless these rights are recognized, the Communist Party will not be in a position to absorb the revolutionary aspirations of youth, which at times in Yugoslavia as well goes by the name of the New Left. Okay, so that is end of chapter 4 of Svetozar Stojanović. Between Ideals and Reality, a critique of socialism and its future. And chapter 4, again, was titled The Communist Party at the Crossroads. Thank you so much for listening.